Gershom, welcome.
It's nice to be here with you.
It's really good to be with you. We have a chance to meet with Gershom every couple of years to talk about his journalism, to talk about his writing and his research. And this year, we're particularly privileged to welcome him because he has a brand new book. This book is remarkable. I have to tell you that it is as good as any sort of spy novel, any good intrigue novel, and yet it's completely true, at least so far. The history is really, the research is well done. It's the War of Shadows, Gershom, Codebreakers, Spies, and the Secret Struggle to Drive the Nazis from the Middle East. It is a really enjoyable read. I spent Shabbos with the book, and I love it. It's a really enjoyable read, and I'm really delighted to welcome an old friend. Gershom, tell us how this book came to be. Tell us what's the essence of this book, and share some of the stories from the book. Turn it over to you.
Okay, Ed, thanks so much. It's really a pleasure to be here, more or less with you. Just one moment. Let me do this little share screen thing. So that, oh, can you, you have to allow me to share a screen. Can you allow me to share a screen? Ah, there we go. Do you see my screen? Okay, great. So when I started working on this book, I told people that I was writing about the war in the Middle East. And I got quizzical looks. People said to me, which war? You know, the Gulf War, the Civil War in Syria, the Six-Day War. And I said, the war, World War II. And then the looks grew more quizzical because it became clear to me that the American memory of the war against Germany in World War II, in American memory, seemed to progress from Pearl Harbor with a big jump to D-Day to a big jump to we won. And yet, for 3 years, more than half of World War II, North Africa was where British and then Allied forces fought Italy and Germany. And for much of that time, the rest of the Middle East was under direct threat of Nazi conquest. And not only that, the real story of the decisive battle was the story of an intelligence breakthrough. And that story is either missing or terribly fragmentary in accounts of the war because the heroes have been erased, and that, as I will explain, is not by accident. So to help you understand this, I want to take you on time travel. This is going to be a guided tour. It's one of those tours that hops from one landmark to another, and in this case, from one date to another. So stay with me. I'll remind you where we are. We're going to make our first stop is going to be Cairo on the 1st of July, 1942. And if you're sitting in this cafe or you're standing on the street looking down between the department stores and the apartment buildings of a city that was built to be the Paris of the Middle East, if you were to look west from downtown toward the Nile, you would see pillars of smoke rising from the General Headquarters Middle East of the British Army, from the Royal Air Force Headquarters, from the British Embassy, from the offices of the Special Operation Executive, the secret agency that supports the resistance in Nazi-occupied countries. And the reason that you're seeing pillars of smoke is that clerks and soldiers are burning papers, code books, war plans, maps, orders, and the fire is so hot that some of the documents don't burn up completely before the heat lifts them up and the secret documents float out over the city. If you want to take cash out of the bank, as nearly everybody does, you'll find lines down the bank, and the tellers are handing out worn bills because they've run out of fresh bills. And there are long lines also outside of the shops selling suitcases. That morning, the 1st of July, 1942, a young British code officer by the name of June Watkins finishes her shift in the Royal Air Force code room, which is in the basement of a downtown hotel. And she goes out on the street and she happens to run into a South African officer who's a friend of hers and who offers to take her for morning coffee at Gropey's Garden Cafe. This is a favorite hangout of British and Commonwealth officers. But the garden is closed. They're told they have to drink their coffee inside. June goes down to the ladies' room and looks out the window, and she sees that in the garden, the waiters are painting signs in German welcoming the officers of German General Erwin Rommel's army. At the train station, well, if you remember the movie Casablanca, the scene in the Paris train station the day before the German army gets there, that's what the Cairo train station looked like, but without the rain. It's packed with people trying to flee. In this case, wanting to get on trains south to Sudan or east for the overnight train east to Palestine. The British Army has reserved 1,600 seats for civilians who are in danger because they worked for the British. And on that list are 100 Italian and German Jews who worked as translators or as informers, secret agents for the British authorities. But the British authorities in Palestine say you can't send them because the 1939 British White Paper drastically limited Jewish immigration. They said, we don't care what's going on in Cairo, you can't let those people in. The Turkish embassy in Cairo radios the Turkish Foreign Ministry in Ankara, and it says, the number of Egyptian Jews who desire visas for Turkey is increasing every day. What should we do? And they get back a radiogram from Ankara that says, requests for visas for traveling to Turkey, if they seem to be abnormal and for emigration purposes, must definitely be refused. Don't let those Jews in. Okay, now we're reading these Turkish telegrams in English. Why is that? Well, they were intercepted by British wireless operators and then decoded and translated by Britain's government communications headquarters, a British intelligence agency whose very existence was unknown to the public. If you saw the movie The Imitation Game, you saw a highly inaccurate version of how GCHQ broke the German Enigma code. It also broke the diplomatic codes of 24 countries, actually including US diplomatic codes and Turkish codes. So you're seeing the decoded and translated versions that were sent to an incredibly small selective group of top British officials, including in some cases to Winston Churchill himself. Everybody in Cairo knew that day that Cairo faced the same fate as Paris or Belgrade or Warsaw, that is Axis conquest. And to understand why they were so certain of this, let's look at the map. 10 days earlier, the Axis army, German and Italian army under Rommel, had conquered the small port of Tobruk in Cyrenaica, which is to say eastern Libya, the Italian colony of Libya. And from there, the British army seemed to be on the edge of collapse. It rapidly retreated, pursued by Rommel. Rommel's forces advanced 350 miles in the space of 10 days to this spot in the desert called El Alamein. Let's stop for a second and talk about this guy, Rommel. He was the most famous of the German generals. His fame in Germany actually began before the war when he published a book called Infantry Tactics, which was really a memoir of his experiences as an infantry commander in the Great War, which is to say World War I. And what he had learned from the trench battles, the terrible trench battles of the Great War, was that a commander should avoid static warfare, instead find a weak spot in the enemy defenses and rush through. In World War II, he became the embodiment, the face of blitzkrieg, of fast mobile warfare. He would eventually write a memoir of his time in North Africa as well. That was called War Without Hate, a description of the war as just some sort of like deadly game between the armies of the two sides. A description which stuck in historical accounts, but which completely ignores the existence of civilians who lived in Libya, Egypt, Tunisia, and other places in the Middle East. the post-war story that would grow around Rommel was that he was a good German, unstained by Nazism, just a great general. His suicide in 1944, after he allegedly, and I stress the word allegedly, took part in a coup against, failed coup against Hitler, helped to cement this image of him as a good German. So hold on to that name, Rommel. But as I said, we're still in the summer of 1942. And if we look back at this map, we will see that Palestine is actually a very uncertain refuge, because the distance from El Alamein, from Tobruk to El Alamein, and the distance from El Alamein to Jerusalem are basically the same. Among the Jews in Eretz Israel, in Palestine, everybody knew Rommel is coming. This was, of course, incredibly frightening, and yet the real meaning was unclear, because what did a German conquest mean? On the one hand, there had been a news item just a few days before from London, based on information smuggled out from Poland to the Polish government in exile in London, that said that more than 700,000 Polish Jews, a third of the Polish Jewish population, had been murdered under the Nazi occupation. And that some of this had taken place by the use of mobile gas chambers mounted on trucks. With information gathered from elsewhere in occupied Europe, the World Jewish Congress then published an item saying that across Nazi-occupied Europe, 1 million Jews had been killed. This, you're seeing how the item appeared in the New York Times of June 30th, 1942, on page 7, next to the Saks Fifth Avenue ads. Now, before you start mumbling about the New York Times not caring about Jews, the New York Times was not alone in its editorial dilemma. You couldn't not report the item, but it seemed too incredible, too absurd to take seriously and to believe. So the editorial compromise was to run it, but to put it on page 7. And the Times was by far not the only newspaper with doubts. This is an editorial that ran in Hebrew on the same day in the Tel Aviv newspaper Hatzofeh. And it says about these numbers: these items come as rumors taken from the air, passed from one informant to another, one writer to another. Hatzofeh actually said news agencies should not be carrying these items because they're just rumors and they're causing despair. So for the 75,000 Jews in Egypt and the 500,000 or more Jews in Palestine, fear of Rommel does not actually match the full threat. What they don't know, for instance, is that in Libya, under orders from Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, the authorities are already trucking the Jews of Cyrenaica, of eastern Libya, to concentration camps in the desert. They don't know that Germany's SS is so confident of Rommel's victory that it has set up an Einsatzkommando, a mobile killing unit for the Middle East. On that same day, the 1st of July, 1942, the commander was appointed, Walter Rauff, an high SS officer, whose orders were to carry out, quote, executive measures, unquote, against the Jews of Egypt, a bureaucratic term for genocide. Once Rommel advances, the targets would be the Jews of Eretz Israel. And if he realized his plans to advance forward all the way to the oil fields of Iraq, the 25,000 Jews of Syria and Lebanon and the over 100,000 Jews in Iraq would have also been his targets. So everything comes down to what's about to happen at that place in the desert, El Alamein. But to understand what happened there in 1942, we need to do some time travel again. We need to go back nearly 3 years to the first week of September 1939, and we're going to go to the train tracks of Poland. We're going to look at 2 trains, one entering Poland and one leaving. The first train left Berlin on the 3rd of September 1939, 2 days after the German invasion of Poland, and it's heading east into Poland. It's codenamed America. That's Hitler's private train. He wants to see his forces conquering Poland. He has a battalion in charge of his security, and in command of that battalion is his favorite general, Erwin Rommel. Rommel proudly writes home to his wife that he'd been invited to sit next to Hitler at lunch, and that he, Rommel, was allowed to chat with him for almost 2 hours unquote, about military problems. Rommel says, he is extraordinarily friendly towards me. Rommel worships Hitler. At the same time that he's sitting in Rommel in Hitler's meeting room on the train every day, the SS and Gestapo chief Reinhard Heydrich tells Germany's military intelligence chief William Canaris, quote, the nobility, the Catholic clergy, and the Jews of Poland must be killed. A officer serving under the German chief of staff, army chief of staff, Franz Halder, writes in his journal that some of what he heard from Halder about the plans for Poland were too awful to write down. So I leave it to you to consider whether Rommel did or did not know the meaning of German victories. Rommel, though, is thinking about the invasion. It fits his idea of rapid warfare, of armored divisions breaking through enemy defenses. But to make that work, a tank wasn't the only machine you needed, because headquarters needed to be in direct touch with the commander of tank forces, who needed to be in contact with the units under them. And the only way to do that was by radio. But sending out your battle plans by radio is shouting them out to the world. As the historian John Ferris has written, only a traitor used radio, only a fool did not. That was the dilemma of commanders. You had to, in some way, encrypt, to code the messages, but traditional codes and ciphers were too easy to break. For instance, as a cipher, one letter repeats another. So if the code breaker picks up a message and Z is the most common letter in the enciphered message, the code breaker knows that Z represents E. But what if you could create a cipher that changed with each letter you wrote, so that if you typed in EEE, it came out TZQ or some other stream of 3 letters, and it just kept changing on and on, apparently randomly. The solution to this problem was a machine put on the market by a Berlin company in the early 1920s, originally for business use, called the Enigma. Here's an Enigma machine with its lid open. What you have is a keyboard in the front. Behind is a light board, a set of 26 little lamps arranged in the same pattern as the keyboard, each marked by a letter. And in the back, there's 3 wheels with gears on the side of them. The way it works is that each of these wheels has 26 contacts, one for each letter of the alphabet, on each side. And inside the wheel, there's a hidden wire connecting the contact on one side with the contact on the other side, but the pattern is hidden. In other words, contact number 1, let's just call it A for this purpose, can be connected to any of the 26 contacts on the other side, and contact number 2 can be connected to any of the remaining 25, and so forth. So you're an Enigma operator, you have a message to send. Let's say you press the letter B on the keyboard. An electric signal runs through the tangle of the wires in all 3 wheels, gets reversed at the other end, runs back, and lights up a letter on the keyboard. The one thing you can be sure of is that the letter that lights up will not be B, but it could be any other letter of the alphabet. And then after you've pressed the key, the wheels move, so the pattern changes. And if you press B again, something else comes up. The clerk takes down the letters that light up on the keyboard, and that's what he sends as his radio message. In 1926, the German Navy adopted Enigma as its signaling system, then the Army, then the Air Force. The beauty of the device was, first of all, it was the size of a typewriter. It weighed 15 pounds. It could be carried in a command car, go anywhere with a general and his code clerk. And to decipher a message that came over radio by enciphered in Enigma, all you had to do was type the coded message into another Enigma machine, and the original clear text message would light up on the keyboard. That is, if you have the right Enigma machine wired in the same way, and that you know all of the starting positions. Well, the possible number of starting positions of settings for an Enigma machine came out to 150 quintillion. That's the small number, because the number of ways that you could set up the wiring within the machine, the number of permutations, is a number for which we don't have a name, but it's equivalent to 5 followed by 92 zeros. It was totally obvious that no one could ever test that many combinations, that there was no mathematic solution to the Enigma cipher. This was, as we call it in our day, unbreakable end-to-end encryption. But I said there were two trains, not just one. The other train was leaving Warsaw 3 days later on September 6th, 1939, and it's also headed east because it's fleeing the German forces. And on board is the man who ultimately can be said to have defeated Rommel. His name is Marian Rejewski. He's a 34-year-old Pole, 10 years a mathematician. 10 years earlier, while he was working on his master's degree in mathematics, he was recruited by Poland's Cipher Bureau, part of military intelligence. And in autumn of 1932, he was assigned to break Enigma. He applied a branch of mathematics to the problem known as permutation theory. In hindsight, it's like absolutely obvious that that's the field of math you would apply. That's hindsight. Nobody but Rejewski thought of doing it. Nobody looked at the problem that way. Everybody else was convinced it was unsolvable. By January of 1933, in under 3 months, he calculated what the wiring was in the Enigma machine. And then he and two assistants found ways to find the settings, which were at that time changed every 3 months. But as war approached, the Germans started changing the settings every day. And Rejewski and his two colleagues couldn't keep up. So in July of 1939, they invited two British cryptologists, code breakers from GCHQ, the Government Communications Headquarters, to Warsaw and shared their work, told them all their secrets. In September of 39, as I said, Rejewski fled. He escaped via Eastern Poland to Romania, where he got papers to go to France, where he continued to advise the British. The best British code breakers never believed that Rejewski had figured out the wiring on his own. That was impossible. They assumed that the Poles had received a stolen Enigma machine. Despite these doubts, all of Britain's work breaking Enigma through the war was based on what Rejewski had done. Okay, let's travel in time again, or in space this time. We're going to be on the same date, but in a different place. While Rejewski is fleeing, the Government Communications Headquarters is settling into its new countryside location, an estate called Bletchley Park, a hideous mansion on the rail line between Oxford and Cambridge in the British countryside. Among the people moving into Bletchley Park is Alan Turing, the Cambridge mathematician, an eccentric man, but unlike the image that you might have gotten from him in the Imitation Game, not an asocial person. In fact, he was sent on delicate missions to parallel agencies in France and the United States. Based on Rejewski's work, Turing came up with the design for a giant machine that could rapidly run through different Enigma settings, looking for the one that could have produced a particular text that you expected to be in the message. For this to work, you needed to have a good idea of a text that would appear in the message. This was called a crib. That is, the whole system depended on the Germans ignoring basic code security and using the same phrases over and over again, whether it was Heil Hitler or Sandstorm or something else. And on the Germans being certain that this didn't matter because they had unbreakable end-to-end encryption. Another one of the people moving into Bletchley Park was Gordon Welchman, also a Cambridge mathematician, an ethereal academician who rapidly became a very practical man. Besides coming up with a design change that actually made Turing's machine work, Welchman's really big idea was that code breaking would no longer be an academic style work of a genius sitting alone in a room working on a single message. Welchman proposes by the fall of 1939 that code breaking has to be turned into essentially an industrial effort, that research on new codes would be divided from the daily work of code breaking, which would be broken down into stages performed by people working in shifts, 3 shifts a day around the clock. Bletchley Park would go from 100 or so people working there when the war started to thousands by the end. Essentially, Welchman transformed Bletchley Park before the term was invented into a high-tech startup. And he himself discovered himself as a manager, as a mover, as a problem solver, and never went back to academia. At first, with the help of the Poles in Paris, Bletchley Park begins finding Enigma settings and reading the messages. This was not a one-time break. You needed to break the settings each day for each network because there was a separate Enigma network using separate settings for different parts of the Army. And then you had to translate and make sense of the messages, which were written in German military jargon and shorthand. You could get a list that said 1, 500, 2, 300, and you didn't know whether that was list meant airplanes or tanks or tons of fuel or some kind of food. You had to figure all of that out. One of the people in charge of this effort would say that we were eavesdroppers, strangers reading stolen scraps of other people's correspondence. Okay, let's stay at Bletchley Park, but we're going to move forward in time to the summer of 1941. Germany has invaded the Soviet Union. British radio operators are picking up the faint messages sent by German units, including special police units in occupied Soviet territory. Bletchley Park has broken the cipher used by the police. These are a couple of the messages that were translated and sent to Winston Churchill. The red ink, by the way, that you'll see here, Churchill always annotated the messages he got in red. So if you see red ink, you know that that was actually what Churchill himself wrote. In this message, it says that Police Regiment South 314 shot 367 Jews. This message from August of 1941. Here's another message from the end of August 1941 saying over 3,000 Jews were shot by various units. Unlike the New York Times or Hatzofeh in Tel Aviv, Bletchley Park and Churchill knew that the massacres were real. They didn't know the full numbers because they're getting scattered messages, scattered bits of the larger picture. But the full reports, of course, are flowing to SS headquarters in Berlin. And in September of 1941, SS Commander Heydrich decides that shooting Jews, which is what his units were doing, was wearing down the SS and police. He wanted to use trucks that transported and murdered at the same time. He assigns the job of producing these trucks to the head of the SS technical arm. You've seen his picture before. It's Walter Rauff. By November of 1941, Rauff has a prototype and begins to go into production. The estimates of the number of people, of the number of Jews murdered in these trucks, are, the low-end estimates are 500,000 people, and it goes up from there. Let's stay on our time machine. Let's stay at Bletchley Park, but we're going to go 2.5 years further back in the future to April 1942. Welchman's crew has finally broken into the Enigma networks used between Berlin and Rommel's headquarters in Libya. And this message is decoded. It says, "It is reported from a good source that the British will not be strong enough to justify an offensive before the 1st of June. This is incredible intelligence. It tells Rommel that he's got to the 1st of June to attack and not be preempted by the British. The message is sent to the desk of a 24-year-old woman named Margaret Story. She had been recruited 2 years before for GCHQ for Bletchley Park at the rank of untrained clerk. Being recruited transformed her life, because by 1942, the success at decrypting German messages was getting into the British commanders' nightmares. We're breaking their messages. What if they're breaking our messages? So they decide they need somebody who will examine decoded German messages for signs of German intelligence, for signs essentially of British information showing up in German messages. And they assign this job to Margaret Story, who is made a research specialist in charge of finding enemy intelligence. I apologize that I cannot show you her picture. She left almost no trace in her life but the documents, the official documents that she wrote. It took me many, many months of detective work to find people who had known her. They told me, picture her as slight, as always wearing dark cardigans, as always smoking, as self-effacing, introspective, as very intelligent, as having daunting intelligence, as having absolutely formidable intelligence, as being shy, very shy, as the brain, as speaking 9 languages, as having a sense of humor, but treating it as labeled top secret ultra. So more messages follow with information from the good source in Cairo. Here's one of Story's reports. This is all material that was classified for decades and is now available in the British National Archives. Here in Story's report, the good source is telling the Germans about British positions, plans, mistakes. Rommel supposedly had a kind of ESP about what the British were planning. In fact, there was nothing supernatural about it. He had the best intelligence source that the Axis had during the entire war. So, of course, the British need to know who or what is the good source and how do we stop it. In retrospect, the suspects included the possibility that a spy had been brought to Cairo by the Hungarian explorer, desert explorer turned German intelligence officer, Laszlo Almasi. By the way, he was also later turned into a highly fictionalized character in the novel and movie The English Patient, with a very slight relationship to the real person. Or perhaps the source was King Farouk of Egypt or somebody close to him. Farouk was 22 years old at the time. His pro-Axis leanings were unfortunately very well known to, his unfortunate Axis leanings were well known to British authorities. What they didn't know was that in 1941, before Britain invaded Persia, Iran, Farouk had actually warned Germany of the coming invasion. In February of 1942, the British ambassador in Egypt had arranged a coup to force Farouk to appoint a pro-Allied prime minister. But Farouk was still king, and maybe the source was somebody close to him. Or maybe it was a British code stolen from an embassy before the war. Major Valentine Vivian, the head of Britain's Foreign Intelligence Agency, MI6, had visited Berlin in 1937 and filed a scathing report about the lack of security at the Berlin embassy. He said that the embassy is completely easily broken into at night. The Gestapo could, if they were so minded, introduce nightly any number of locksmiths and experts in safe breaking, having continuous access to current papers, telegrams, and prints, and for that matter, code books, without leaving any trace. So maybe that's where the good source is coming from. I'm going to leave that mystery for you for the book, but I'm going to jump forward in time, another small jump. We're going to June 21st, 1942. Rommel has just taken Tobruk. His orders from Rome and Berlin are to advance no further than the Egyptian-Libyan border. But then he gets this message from the good source. The British were decisively beaten owing to insufficient defense. If Rommel intends to take the Nile Delta, that is to say where Cairo and Alexandria are, this is a suitable moment. Well, Rommel, who in any case had the personality of a compulsive gambler, has just gotten an inside tip. He's reading the enemy's cards. He ignores his orders. He invades Egypt. He needs to get to Alexandria to have a port where he can receive supplies brought by Italian ships across the Mediterranean. He actually needs to get beyond Alexandria all the way to Palestine because there were RAF bases there from which planes could attack ships coming across the Mediterranean. The good source tells him that the British defense, the British final defense, sorry, let me go back one, will be at this spot, Mersa Matruh, a spot along the Egyptian coastline. Here's where the turning point comes. A careful comparison of Allied and Axis intelligence documents showed me that this is when the good source was silenced. Some of those documents actually were ones I found by locating a descendant of a key officer involved in the events of that time. How was the good source silenced? Again, I will leave that for the book. I don't want to give you too many spoilers, but on June 25th, 1942, General Auchinleck, the commander of Britain's Middle East Command, changes his defensive plan and decides that the British defense will be mounted here at El Alamein and in a line heading into the desert. He decides that because this is the narrowest spot between the coastline and the cliffs of the Qatar Depression. At El Alamein, there's no way that Rommel can swing out in the desert around the British line. He has to attack the line directly. So it's a much better spot for defense. All of this is being broken by Welchman's crew and being read at Bletchley Park. But the information is no longer reaching Rommel. Instead, when he gets to El Alamein, he's blocked. There's weeks of fighting. He can't advance. His supply line consists of trucks that have to drive all the way from Libya. He can't go forward. On the 20th July, Walter Rauff flies from Greece to Tobruk to El Alamein to meet Rommel's chief of staff. And he's told, our advance to Cairo has been slowed down. You'll have to wait. We're short on supplies, especially fuel. You and your team should wait in Athens for Rommel to take the Nile. But that never happened. El Alamein was literally the line in the sand where the British army stopped the Axis army. By British, by the way, I mean British in a very wide sense. It included Indians, South Africans, New Zealanders, Australians, Free Franks, Free Poles. It took until November of that year before the British, under a new commander, Bernard Montgomery, drove the Axis forces back. And Churchill would call that point in the Battle of El Alamein the end of the beginning of the war, the turning point. But I would argue that the real end of the beginning was earlier, in July. Once Rommel was stopped short of the port of Alexandria, his army was doomed. A constant stream of deciphered Enigma messages show that his army was short of fuel, food, and supplies. He can't reach Alexandria, and Hitler won't let him retreat. He had been incredibly confident right before he got to El Alamein. His medical officer was already giving instructions for not drinking the water in Egyptian cities. He had expected that that there would be a small British force at El Alamein. It would be mopping up a strong point, but this was all because the good source had gone silent. He never reached Cairo. The SS under Rauff never reached Cairo or Jerusalem. And Rommel never knew the role of Ryuski or Welchman, Turing, or Margaret Story in his defeat. So why did this story remain hidden even after the war? An answer to that is given in a British order issued in April 1945 as victory in Europe became close. This was an order sent out to the small number of people who knew the Enigma secret. And what they were told was, you may never talk about this for the rest of your life. This is classified information, not just now, but forever. And a number of reasons given, but were given in the order, but this is the first one and the most important. No possible excuse must be given to the Germans to explain away their complete defeat by force of arms. The British command was aware that after World War I, all sorts of conspiracy theories had spread in Germany. The famous stab in the back theory that somehow Germany had been betrayed and hadn't actually been defeated on the battlefield. The British did not want to give any opening for such theories again. And the Germans, finding out the decisive role that intelligence had played in their defeat, might lead, they feared, to Germany deciding to try a third time to conquer Europe. So everybody who worked on Enigma, everybody who fought the War of Shadows, was essentially told that, well, yes, you played an extraordinary role in the victory. For the victory to last, history must not remember you. Let me close with a couple of thoughts. First of all, Enigma could be broken, this supposedly unbreakable encryption, because human beings designed it. And another human being could look at the problem differently. And also because people took shortcuts. People repeated phrases. They got careless. They did the equivalent of what happens today when you're told to create a really fancy long password and then you stick it on a Post-it on your computer screen. The flaw in the machine was the human beings who used it. The technology has changed vastly since 1942, but people haven't. So perfect security keeps failing. The second thing is, that were it not for the victory at El Alamein, the SS would have reached Cairo and Palestine. This is only one part, and there's more in the book, in War of Shadows, of how our usual picture of the Holocaust as being only in Europe is geographically too narrow. And also, this is a very small sampling of the intrigues that would shape the Middle East after the war that are described in War of Shadows. Just as a start, that 1942 coup in Egypt discredited King Farouk and served as a catalyst of the 1952 Egyptian revolution, which brought Nasser and then Sadat to power. So a whole series of post-war events up to our day essentially have their roots in what happened during these years. I hope to have honored those forgotten heroes, and I hope that you enjoy reading the full story of the War of Shadows. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gersha. That's remarkable, remarkable story. How close to these people did you get in your research? I don't imagine any of them are still living, but they have children or they have family still living that you found?
Um, the great majority of the work on this book, because of the distance in time, was archival, was looking for papers. In most cases, how close I got to them was holding in my hands the papers that anonymous people or that Churchill or that Roosevelt or that Rommel had written, which is an incredible experience, especially when I found them not in the archives. But to answer the second part of your question, there were things that were missing from the archives, and then I either simply knowledge about the people, the official documents didn't tell me who these people were, who they were as human beings in most cases, and sometimes really important basic documents were missing. So I went searching for children and grandchildren or people who had known them. I found the granddaughter of one incredibly important American figure in this story, who I haven't talked about now, but you can read about in the book. It took me many months of work to find her, and I called her, and I called her again. And people don't answer the phone anymore, right? They don't see the number. If they don't know the number. So finally, I said, I'm giving up here, on being polite. I called 30 times in a row. I just kept pressing, call. And finally, she picks up the phone. And I said very quickly, I'm a historian calling from Jerusalem. I'm interested in your grandfather. And she says, oh, I thought you were a telemarketer. And then I said, do you have any of your grandfather's papers? Well, it turns out she had inherited her grandfather's house. And there was a stack of manila envelopes in the attic that nobody had ever opened. And when they brought them down, I was visiting Washington. I was very happy that she didn't live in Wyoming because it made it easier for me to get to her. They spread out these envelopes on the dining room table, and I opened them up, and there were the cables that were missing from the American archive that told a big part of the story. And she could also tell me about her grandfather. In the case of Margaret's story, the problem was even greater. She never married. She died childless. I had no information about her except for the documents that she wrote, which were fascinating. By the way, in the archives, she was always referred to as Miss Story. And I'm a Hebrew speaker, and I'm looking at this, and it says Miss Story, which in Hebrew means mysterious. And I said, yeah, she's mysterious. I eventually figured out where she moved after the war from the official documents, and I contacted a local historical society and ran an ad in their journal. Anybody knows Margaret's story, please get in touch with me. A couple people did. Then the society found me her will, which listed a couple of relatives. I ended up talking to 4 or 5 people who had known her, and that was how I was able to create a picture. And I also did do a couple of interviews with people in their 90s here, which was fascinating. I interviewed the Israeli writer, journalist, and activist Uri Avneri and the poet journalist Chaim Guri, both of them over 90 at the time, both of them perfectly clear-minded, incredible memories, both of them telling me that at that moment as young men, they knew that Rommel was coming. Totally different in their personalities, but very much their memories lined up of just how great the fear was in Eretz Israel that the Germans were about to arrive.
Wow. I mean, it sounds, we've talked about this before. It sounds so much like a, if not a movie, it's certainly a mini series, and I certainly hope that somebody takes you up and actually does this. So if it does become that kind of a presentation, which of the characters is the most vivid character? I mean, you're a writer of some great talent, but if you were writing this not as a historical book or a journalistic piece, but if you're writing this as a movie script, who would you base it around? Which of the characters would you think is the most vivid of all the characters?
Wow, it's such an incredible cast, and I want to say that as a writer, what I do is look not only for the events, but for who the people were and for every sign of what they were thinking. I look for private diaries. I look at photographs to see what the people were like. So I'll just give you a few examples. I mentioned Almasi, the Hungarian explorer, and there was his rival, the British explorer, Ralph Bagnold, who went on to create the sort of ancestor of all the special reconnaissance units we see in the world, the Long Range Desert Group. Amazing, fascinating man. There was Margaret Story herself, and how this shy, brilliant figure played this incredible role in the war and never talked to anybody about it. And the other code breakers. There's a long list of these just amazing, eccentric, brilliant people who did what was impossible. Ryuski is another example. On the other side, of course, there's Rommel. There's an Italian intelligence officer named Manfredi Talamo, who was both fascist Italy's greatest intelligence officer, secret agent, and also died as an anti-Nazi martyr. So that was an amazing figure. One of the people that really caught in my mind was somebody named Eliyahu, or Ernst Gottlieb. He was a German-born Palestinian Jew. When the war broke out in 1939, he was 15 years old. He tried to lie about his age and sign up for the British Army. They figured out he was 15 and wouldn't let him. 2 years later, in 1941, he lied again. This was actually his third try. He said he was 19. In order to get out of the requirement that your parents would sign for you, he said he'd left his parents behind in Germany, showed up with a false biography stamped by the German Immigrant Society in Haifa, and succeeded in signing up for the British Army, and was assigned to a commando group that was created in the spring of 1942 that consisted entirely of German-born Jews from Palestine who were trained to impersonate Nazis. They were trained by two anti-Nazi German POWs to walk, talk, shoot, behave, sing, use the slang of German soldiers, and were sent on a mission deep behind German lines in Libya, carrying photographs of their supposed German girlfriends who were in fact British women soldiers.
Vivid characters.
Amazing people.
Talk about Rommel for just a moment. You said that Rommel commits suicide at the end of the war. Did he find out? I mean, without giving away the secrets of the book, of course, and I appreciate, not giving away spoilers, but did he find out that his intelligence had been tapped? Did he find out
No.
Did he ever suspect that what the British were doing to him?
He did not know about the big break. Ironically, one of the intelligence documents he got that was based on this good source told him that his low-level, easy ciphers being used on the battlefield were being broken. Yeah. But the big break of Enigma and how much it contributed to his defeat, he never knew. In fact, nobody knew. This secret was kept for 30 years after the war, and when it finally came out in the 70s, German officers refused to believe it. They said, Enigma is unbreakable, this is nonsense. And it was very, very hard for them to accept that it had been broken. And that in itself is an essential part of the story, the overconfidence in the code. And this is incredibly relevant to today. This is something that we see over and over again. Somebody puts together this fantastic technical system and they just They look at it the way that they look at it. They go over it again and again and again, and it's unbreakable. And the fact that somebody else can look at the problem sideways from underneath and see it differently is just, this is a fantastic aspect of the human mind, the way one mind can close around the solution and another mind that's not closed around the solution can say, ah, that's the way in. And that's what happened to the Germans. Rommel never knew. The German army never knew. It was critical to the victory. And in many ways, that pattern continues to repeat itself in our world in totally different technological universe,
Right.
but the same problem.
Well, it's also Rommel was also the greatest infantry officer in the world. I mean, even Patton revered him, right? And Patton was really the greatest infantry. And Rommel depended on, he knew that he was a better soldier than anybody in the world. He couldn't imagine that a bunch of wimpy Cambridge mathematicians had beat him.
He would not have been able to imagine that, and he certainly believed that he was the greatest. He also believed that he was much greater than anybody in the German command. How great Rommel was, the legend around Rommel, there's a whole debate in Germany about the Rommel legend, and there's a lot of holes in it. One of the major holes to which I alluded in the talk is that Rommel, who had never had staff training, did not pay enough attention to logistics, to getting his supplies. And the German command knew that in the desert, supplies were a much bigger problem than elsewhere, that they needed, for instance, for desert fighting, 10 times as many trucks to supply the forces as they did in Europe, because even water had to be brought to the front over long distances. And by the way, just one detail about this, when I started going through American documents, I found these files of what supplies, Lend-Lease supplies, were sent to the British in Africa. And what I expected to find at the top of the list would be tanks and airplanes. And at the beginning, certainly, and for a long time, what was at the top of the supply? Trucks. Trucks produced in American factories were being sent around the Cape, across the Atlantic, around Africa, up the Indian Ocean to the Suez Canal to supply the British, because you just could not fight in the desert without a huge number of trucks to bring supplies to the front. And Rommel, this was one of Rommel's weak points, was not understanding this.
So I'm trying to think of the right relevant question to ask. You're a very gifted political journalist and cultural observer. And this experience of having stepped back out of the contemporaneous moment, which is so fraught, back into another time, a time of remarkable self-sacrifice, of heroism, a time when there were really good guys and bad guys, when wars really were really good guys fighting against bad guys. In a certain way, this must have given you a certain, I don't know, a sort of sense of relief and a sense of a respite from the kind of stuff that you see every day in the daily news, the daily politics that you cover, that you write about, that you analyze. To really see this kind of a real moral war of good against evil, and the self-sacrifice of people to try to and the willingness of people to make huge sacrifice. The idea that people would take this story to the grave and never tell another person, I was the one that broke the code.
Well, I'll say a couple of things about that. First of all, when I started moving, I came to this out of daily journalism. And the first time I started doing archival work was in depth was for my book, The Accidental Empire, on the history of Israeli settlements. And one of the first things that struck me the moment I dove into the archives was everything I knew was wrong. That I would read the transcripts of Kissinger's shuttle diplomacy and the news reports from the same day, and this sense of humility as a journalist just washed over me. How little do we know about what's really going on? How much do the documents tell a story that doesn't come out at the time? And how much of it has been leaked, even if it's true in a partial way that's meant to be deceptive, and made me very, very cautious about a lot of reporting. Specifically, reporting about diplomacy, intelligence, and the military. how we, yes, people are doing great jobs. I have great respect for my colleagues, but when you read that material, for instance, when you read a story about a spy breakthrough that appears in today's paper or website, ask yourself the question of why is somebody leaking that and what purpose is it serving? Because that's why it gets leaked, is because somebody is trying to accomplish something by doing that. The second thing is, there are people like that today. Well, in both directions. There are many of the figures that I read about who are, what I look for is their complexity. And they were morally complex. The same people who were fighting the Nazis, the same British officials who were fighting the Nazis, had tremendous disrespect for the Egyptians and a desire to continue their colonial rule over them. And that created all sorts of problems. They had often had tremendous disrespect for the local Jews. And, there's this old British line that in Britain, anti-Semitism is hating the Jews more than is necessary. And I ran across upsetting anti-Semitic lines in the British document. So people were morally complex then too. And on the other hand, Ed, I know people today who know secrets, who have dedicated their lives to serving their country, and in my case, to people who've dedicated their lives to serving Israel. And some of them know secrets. I asked them, when will you be able to tell me about this? And they said, never. So the long-range view of the past also taught me to appreciate those people today more. You may not notice them. They do not introduce themselves as knowing secrets. They are among you.
I can't resist the temptation to ask you to break away from the book for just a moment and reflect with us for a moment. You're sitting in Jerusalem. There's, I think, your fourth election in a row is coming up soon.
I think so. It's hard to keep track.
I have a friend who made Aliyah a year and a half ago, and he says, hell, I voted 3 times already. The fourth election, the Israel is now vaccinating at a higher rate than anybody else in the world. There is some tension between West Bank vaccinations, Gaza vaccinations. Just give us a moment, if you could, just take a moment and give us a précis of what's going on in Israel. What does it feel like on the street?
Well, look, first of all, we are also in Corona shock. People have been living in very small worlds. Kids have not been in school. It's been hardest for the kids. And I've seen people go through hard times here, and each of them is different. Is this easier or harder for you if you're 10 years old than the Intifada was? I don't know if there's any way to compare it, but it's very, very difficult, especially for the youngest people in society and for the oldest ones. That's the same all over. The vaccination is incredible. And the vaccination, I have to say, shows a tension between two Israels, because the current leadership, Netanyahu and the people around him, have done a catastrophic job of managing the pandemic from day to day, letting up on the lockdown too early, of not limiting travel when it was essential to do so, just one mistake after another. On the other hand, the HMOs, the Kupot Cholim, the socialized medical system, created a generation before the state was, still functioning, have performed this astounding job of mass vaccination, of just getting the vaccines to people quickly, efficiently. And that is really, really impressive. And I can only say to you, it's one more lesson in how, socialized medicine is a really, really good thing. When you call up the phone at 1 o'clock in the morning, the day after vaccines are announced, and I say, I'd like to get vaccinated, and the person at the other end says, certainly, and then says the name of my wife and says, does she want a vaccine as well? And 2 days later, we're getting our vaccines. Wow. The system works. The medical system works. It's heroic. You talked about people who are dedicated. One of the things, by the way, that's impressive watching the medical system is probably the most integrated, Arab-Jewish integrated structure in Israeli society. I don't know if people abroad realize this, but the professions into which Israeli Arabs are moving most quickly are the medical professions. It started with nursing and then pharmacy and then in medicine, to the extent that today the stereotype of a medical student is a young Arab. And together, working together, they're just doing an amazing job.
That's wonderful to hear. That's a story that needs to be told. That's a story that needs to be told. Gershom, thank you. Congratulations on the book. It's called War of Shadows. It's available on Amazon. That's where I got it really quickly. And we wish you great success with the book. And when the movie comes out, we'll have you come on again with whichever star is going to play you or or play Margaret's story. We'll have you on. Okay.
God willing. And that time I will come in person to speak there, because we will be post-pandemic.
We'll get Gwyneth Paltrow or Scarlett Johansson to play Margaret's story, and you'll come on. You'll come on and do her story with her. Thank you so much, and congratulations. And thank you to everyone who's listening tonight. And we wish you a very pleasant